What if the middle class didn't just shrink, it was shrunk? Did America's elites quietly replace capitalism with something far more unstable? In my book, American Restraint, I argue that the forces of hyper-capitalism and its cousin, hyper-individualism, are tearing this country apart. In the last few episodes, we discussed and explored how cultural elites pushed excessive individualism that has undermined families and local communities. But now we're going to turn to something even more potentially destabilizing: the economy. Specifically, how hyper-capitalism, driven by the oligarch class, has gutted the American middle class. So, one thing that's important to note about the oligarch class: I define this group mostly as billionaires, as well as leaders of our main government, media, business, and universities. These elites, especially the billionaires, are on both the right and the left, and they like the status quo. Because for them, when average Americans are pitted against one another, the oligarchs profit handsomely. But let's be clear, capitalism, when practiced with restraint and embedded in community, is a good thing. It rewards hard work, creates opportunity, and builds a thriving middle class. But hyper-capitalism, an ideology pushed by elites since the 1970s, rewards only the top, extracts wealth and income from the middle and bottom, and destabilizes everything in between. All right. Hello, America. I'm Patrick Trepanier, and welcome to the American Restraint podcast, where we talk about how to fix America by downsizing DC and giving power back to the states. Today, I want to give a quick shout out to anyone who's ever lost a pet. No, this isn't an advertisement. Last week, we lost our wonderful 2-year-old white lab, Yuki. It totally sucks to lose a pet. If any of you have gone through this, I know what you're going through. I'll see her again someday, though. But bless up, Yuki. All right, back to the show. Today's episode is titled, How to Fix America. How the Oligarchs Broke Capitalism. First, why the middle class matters. So a strong middle class is the backbone of a healthy country. It offers stability, resilience, and moral strength to the families, neighborhoods, and local institutions. But today, the middle class is shrinking, anxious, and increasingly fragile. So today, we're going to look at some data. We're going to look at some charts. Let's look at this first one. This one is a really interesting about the household income pie. And this is kind of aggregated across the entire country over time. So if you look at this chart, it shows that in 1970, the average American middle class, the American middle class, an aggregate number, right, held 62% of all household income. That makes sense. It's 50% of the population is the middle class. The upper class held about 29% of all of the household income in the country. And the lower class held about 10%. Fast forward to 2022, the middle class now just holds 43% of the income, while the upper class, with still only 20% of the population, is ballooned to 48% of the aggregate income. So roughly 20 percentage points, right, have shifted from the middle class, which is more people statistically than the upper class. 20% of the aggregate income in this country has gone to the upper class. That's not a free market outcome. That's picking winners and losers. The upper class won, while the middle class and lower class are losing. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about how the oligarchs rigged the system. Senator Marco Rubio said it pretty bluntly. Over the past several decades, our nation's political and economic leaders, they made choices to prize economic efficiency over resiliency, financial gains over Main Street investment, and individual enrichment over the common good. These weren't accidents. They were policy decisions made by both Republicans and Democrats that undermined the middle class. Republicans eliminated stable pensions and replaced them with 401ks in the Wall Street casino. Conservatives turned a blind eye to soaring healthcare costs, calling it the free market at work. Democrats who control, they are maybe losing control, most of higher education, allowed college tuition to skyrocket with no accountability. Both parties ignored the housing crisis, particularly in big cities where zoning, NIMBYism, environmental regulation, and speculation priced families out. And as these costs rose, jobs got less stable. The gig economy replaced secure employment for a lot of people. Union power declined, and workers didn't really have any power against executives. Wages stagnated. Now, let's look at another graph here. This one's about overall wealth. In 1983, the upper class held about 60% of America's wealth. Now, if you fast forward about 35 years or so, by 2016, that number hit 79%, almost 80% of wealth, held again by roughly 20% of the population. The middle class, meanwhile, went from holding about 32% of the wealth in the country to just 17% of the wealth. The lower class held only 4%. And this story can be told many different ways, right? You can look at average holdings of Wall Street, and the very small percentage, the upper 10%, hold a massive percentage of Wall Street assets, like 80% or something like that. And the middle class, which again is 50% of the population, does not hold nearly as much as proportionally they should. A lot of this is due to hyper-capitalism. I think you could explain it almost all to hyper-capitalism. So this wasn't just about income, it was about security. Families who once had pensions and savings and equity now live paycheck to paycheck. So let's talk a little bit more about that explosion of wealth for the upper classes, the CEO jackpot. In 1965, the average CEO made 15 times more than the average worker. There was a lot more, we're all in this together at the company with both management and the workers. However, if you fast forward almost 60 years, by 2020, that ratio had exploded to 320 to 1. The elites would say that the executives and CEOs earned that money, but they did it by outsourcing jobs, cutting healthcare benefits, slashing wages, consolidating industries, and avoiding taxes. So just a little bit of an interesting personal story here. I used to work in corporate America, so I've seen this firsthand. When average employees get laid off, which is unfortunately more and more common over the past few decades, they usually get 2, and if they're lucky, I think 4 weeks of severance, and hopefully a couple of months of healthcare coverage. But when CEOs and the rest of the C-suite get fired, they usually get a very rich package, sometimes millions of dollars, a sweet consulting package, which basically means nothing, but they get paid for doing nothing, lots of stock options, and a year of healthcare coverage. It's all because C-level executives have employment contracts that guarantee they get rich if the company does well, and they get a huge payout even if they get fired for doing a crappy job. That's not sour grapes on my part, or any other worker who's lost their job because of poor CEO performance. It's not capitalism, is what I'm trying to say. It's oligarchy. The American dream has been cut in half. If you were born in 1940, you had a 92% chance of out-earning your parents. If you were born in 1980, that number drops to 50%. Half of young Americans no longer believe they'll do better than their parents. And they're right. I think that these numbers about the American dream diminishing, especially from those who are the younger generation, really coincides with something we talked about in previous episodes. In the 1960s, the American adult decided that their own self-interest was more important than the interest of their children. And I think that the economic data really plays that out. America used to be a country that the adults and the parents wanted a better dream and a better world and a better economy for their kids. Now, not so much. And author Joel Kotkin argues that we're kind of entering a new form of neo-feudalism, he calls it. A tiny elite owns almost everything, while the rest of the population rents, hustles, and survives. Charles Murray made a similar point in his great book, Coming Apart. If you are born into the upper class, life is pretty good. You're going to work hard, but you'll be rewarded pretty nicely. If you're not born in the upper class, your odds of stability, marriage, and mobility plummet. This isn't just about class, it's about control. The elite class doesn't care about race or ideology. They care about collecting wealth, land, and power. So I argue that hyper-capitalism was a choice. It didn't have to happen. We could have kept pensions for employees. We could have more shared prosperity, and we're all in this together between CEOs and employees. Just a side note here, or actually a couple of side notes. Go to Glassdoor, look up just about any company, and you will see honest feedback, because it's totally, private feedback. Employees just saying executives are out of touch, executives don't get it, executives don't care. And unfortunately, over the past few decades, that's become more and more of a theme. So back a little bit more to healthcare. We could have more affordable healthcare that wasn't dependent on executives and companies, like Satya Nadella, the CEO at Microsoft, who this year, we're still not done. What are we in August right now? So about 2/3 of the year through, and he's already laid off over 15,000 workers at Microsoft. While Microsoft, they just blew out their earnings last week. They just joined the $4 trillion market cap club. And Nadella, he's probably going to earn another $75 million this year. So it's great, again, for the CEOs and the oligarchs and the elite, but hypercapitalism, not so great for the average workers and middle class. Additionally, we could have made college affordable and housing attainable, but we didn't. And the people who benefited must now run, the people who benefited mostly now run the entire show. How to fix it? A restraint formula for the middle class. We need to maximize the size and health of the middle class. Over the next few weeks, our episodes are going to focus on policy prescriptions and ideas to help increase the size, income, and wealth of the middle class. We'll discuss how large-scale illegal immigration, excessive market concentration of big businesses, and rampant fraud and speculation by Wall Street have crushed the middle class and led to their insecurities about the cost of living, the cost of housing, the cost of healthcare, cost of higher education, and retirement. But mostly we're going to talk about how oligarchs broke capitalism and turned it into something I call hyper-capitalism. Let's build a country where most people live in the middle, not clinging to the bottom or hoarding at the top. Okay, so some closing thoughts here. We've kind of been sold a myth about capitalism, and we've been sold a myth that inequality is the price of freedom. But in truth, too much inequality destroys freedom. It breeds anxiety, distrust, resentment, and isolation. It breaks families and erodes communities. The American dream still does matter, but it's only possible when we practice economic restraint. America can be fixed, but only if we restore the middle class. America can be fixed, but only if we choose restraint. All right, that's it for now. We'll see you next week, and have a great day.